Hello, my name is Michael Swinford. We'd like to welcome you back to part 2 of our discussion with Vietnam veterans. We'll be talking about some of the myths of Vietnam and some misconceptions and some of our memories. So stay tuned. We'll be right back after this. Welcome back, Mr. Robert Englert from Cadiz, Mr. Curtis Holmes from Cadiz, Dr. Gordon Williams from Paducah, all Vietnam veterans, and all have different stories to tell. As I was researching this show today, I came across some numbers of people who were killed in Vietnam and whose name is on the wall. It was amazing to me. There were 382 suicides during the time of the Vietnam War in Vietnam. There were 273 heart attacks. And what surprised me is there was 234 homicides. And there was 42 deaths occurred by stroke. And there's 482 people that died from illnesses. And most of their names, if not all their names, are on the wall in Washington. Gordon, I believe you have some insight into the wall.
Well, I think one of the one of the myths that we might want to talk about is most people, and I've heard this many times from media people, who quote there are 58,000 plus names on the wall in Washington. That's how many people died in Vietnam. That's not true at all. That's very inaccurate. And the reason that it's inaccurate, when the Vietnam Vets Memorial was being debated and talked about, it was a long, circuitous route. A fellow by the name of Jan Scruggs, another gentleman, John Wheeler. They were the shakers and movers. The federal government did not want the wall to be built. They tried to give those guys a half-an-acre lot behind a used car lot over in Arlington, Virginia. And to make a long story short, they were finally given essentially 2 acres of land where the wall now is. The competition for the design took place. Maya Ling's design was the winner. But what happened was, given the amount of space that they had and given the design that they were not able to fit all of the names that needed to be fitted on that wall. So they had to use a cutoff criteria. And what they used was only those people who died in country's names are on that wall. So if a soldier was severely wounded and medevac to Japan or the Philippines or back home here to Walter Reed, and they died later on here, their names are not on the wall. And that has been a source of confusion, because the number of deaths in Vietnam is drastically understated by saying that 58,000 plus names are on the wall, and that's the number of people who died in Vietnam. It's many more than that. Yeah. And that's been a heartache for Scruggs and the other people who were involved with the building of the wall. They knew that that was going to antagonize the families of all the other people who died as a result of injuries in Vietnam, whose names are not on the wall. The new educational center is now being built as we speak next to the wall. It'll be underground. It will have classrooms to try to educate future generations about Vietnam. And it will also have another wall down there where the additional names of all of the people, additional people who died in Vietnam, who died as a result of injuries in Vietnam, but who did not die in country, their names will be on that additional wall. I don't know how many names are all together, but it's far beyond 58,000. And that's a significant misunderstanding about the number of casualties in Vietnam.
Well, a lot of news media back then, they thought that only fighting was going on in South Vietnam. They didn't realize that we had gone into Cambodia and gone into Laos, and the excursion, if you want to call it that, into Cambodia brought on some of the harshest critics in Washington because we had violated their land space, when in reality the Ho Chi Minh Trail runs through Laos and Cambodia, and in order to stop the supplies. Did you all, either one, have to go into Laos or Cambodia?
Not me.
The Special Forces camp I was in was 2 kilometers from Cambodia, and from our camp you could see truck headlights, not like Nashville rush hour, but you would see each night there would be, if you were out there at the right time, you would see some lights where they were driving down. And so Cambodia was being violated by both sides. But that camp was put where it was to monitor infiltration. And we were in it was the 3 Corps area of the country, and we were at there was a village, had been a village there, and there was an old road that ran from Saigon to a little town in Cambodia that I don't remember. But anyway, we were on the main drag, and the bad guys, from my point of view, took exception to that, and they didn't like us being there.
Well, Robert, what do you think about the fact that a lot of Vietnam veterans and veterans in general say that we didn't lose a battle in Vietnam?
Well, it sounds like an impossible statement. I would take that as veterans responding to the sense that they lost the war due to their own inadequacies, and that's not the case. But surely, and we've talked about that among ourselves, what you would call a battle would be what you called lost by whatever measure you apply. And I'm going to say in some cases, certainly.
Well, the next statement to that question was, well, if you never lost a battle, why didn't you win the war?
It was lost in Washington.
Yeah.
Amen.
You got lost amid the political infighting.
I think that's something that's so important to try to keep in mind. You know, we've gone into some of the high school history classes over the years, and one of the things we try to emphasize to the students is it's important to look at Vietnam both from the point of view of the military part of it and from the political aspect of it. Militarily, we did quite well. But as Curtis is saying, from a political point of view, the people in Washington made decisions that led to the final outcome. But it wasn't because of the military, it was because of the politicians.
Well, and I hope the nation's majority's feelings back home about that war is the reason that war ended.
Yeah.
We came home. We didn't get kicked out or lose. The powers back in the United States couldn't take the political heat. Of course, it was obviously a long string of many mistakes. That war should not have, either shouldn't have started or should have ended a lot sooner.
Well, from a political point of view, not only was it in Washington, but it was also in South Vietnam. The political structure was totally corrupt. And that brings to mind another question. Are any of you familiar with the Phoenix program?
Somewhat.
Yeah.
The Phoenix program is a program where you would send people from the CIA or maybe even military people to go and assassinate a leader of the village or some high political figure. In fact, CIA assassinated one of the presidents of South Vietnam so we could instill our own guy in, so to speak. But it was a very controversial program then, and it still is for people that had to participate in that, because it was just out and out murder. But at the time, somebody in Washington thought it'd be a good idea that if they don't agree with us, we'll just take a sniper and kill them. And that was a controversy in Vietnam. And that controversy carried over to the Iraq and Afghani wars because they made great use of snipers, as we learned in a previous program.
You can draw a parallel to Iraq, and I was the only one at my workplace that had been in the Army, so you know, it's one thing to defeat an army, it's another thing to build a country, and you can't just because you can beat their army doesn't mean that you can help them build their country. People don't, if they don't grasp the idea of voting and freedom and parliamentary, what are you going to do? You know,
that was one of the things that became so painfully clear to me soon after I arrived in Vietnam. I thought, I don't think these people are prepared for a Jeffersonian democracy the way we have in the United States. They were villagers, they were tribal, just like the Iraqis are.
Right.
And when you talk to those people about, we're going to help you to elect officials that you're going to then send to Saigon, and there will be parliamentary procedures in your Congress, they would look at us with a blank stare and essentially would say, well, get your tank out of, please get your tank out of my rice paddy. It went in one ear and out the other. This is going to be a serious problem. These people are not ready for the type of democracy that we're thinking that they want, and that they're not. And I think the same situation exists in Iraq today.
You've got tribal fighting, and you know the tribe's more important than the country.
Yeah.
Do any of you see Vietnam War as a spiritual war, as opposed to a physical war or any other time?
Well, there was a spiritual aspect to the war that I didn't realize at the time, but 90% of the Vietnamese population is Buddhist, and when we were there, almost all of the key government positions were held by Catholics because the Catholics had befriended the French, and therefore most of the key government positions were held by Catholics. And I'm not trying to say anti-Catholic comments, just saying that that imbalance existed, and I think that's why those Buddhist monks did what they did. I couldn't understand why they did what they did at the time, but as I learned more later, my goodness, if 90% of the people are of one religious persuasion and none of them are participating in the government, those people are going to get pretty upset.
I actually took a photograph of the car. Was a taxi cab that brought the Buddhist monk into Saigon so he could set himself afire. Let me take your idea a little bit farther, Gordon. True, the Catholics had the power, if you will, and the Buddhists had the numbers, but not the power. But the Archbishop of Vietnam was a personal friend of Cardinal Cushing in New York. They knew each other quite well. Now, Cardinal Cushing was a very good friend of JFK, or John F. Kennedy. Now, I'm not saying that had anything to do with John Kennedy keeping the forces in place in Vietnam and, in essence, adding to them. But over the years, I've wondered if that was a possibility, that perhaps that could have influenced some of the decisions made about keeping troops in Vietnam.
Well, I'm not sure that connection exists. I think I'd mentioned before we began filming, fascinating book that Robert McNamara wrote, the Secretary of Defense during most of the Vietnam War. In his book, In Retrospect, it's a wonderful book to read. It's like you're able to stick your head in the huddle and find out what the team is really preparing to do. And in that book, what he says, and he says it numerous times, John Kennedy, his plan was 15,000 advisors in Southeast Asia. The Vietnamese will either sink or swim. If they sink, in the eyes of the world, we will have looked like we had attempted to do the best we could do. If they do well, that would be even better. But McNamara then says, in the aftermath of Kennedy's assassination, that Lyndon Johnson said, Kennedy's from Boston and I'm from Austin, and we're going to do it the Austin way. And whatever the Kennedy way was, the Austin way is going to be the opposite. And some of the advisors said, wait a minute, well, let's think more about this 15,000 advisors. And he said, no, we're not going to do it that way. So McNamara makes the point that the key issue was that Johnson was trying to formulate the war in the way that he wanted it so that he would stand distinct from Kennedy. So there, I don't know if those other connections may have been there or not, but that was an important point I thought made by McNamara.
Let me ask this question. Do you feel like that if John F. Kennedy hadn't got assassinated, that perhaps the outcome in Vietnam would have been different? Gordon kind of alluded to it.
I think if we had kept it at 15,000 advisors, it never would have gotten as big. And you either help them and they do it, or you help them and they don't do it, but we can't do it for them.
That's the answer.
You know, it's like teaching your child to potty train. You can show him, but he's got to take the bull. He's got to do it himself. You know, you can't do it for him, and that's the way I think. I think he made a good point. Gordon did.
Well, there were quotations from John F. Kennedy before he was killed that he really was not awfully concerned about Vietnam, but he knew he had to have a token presence there. But as far as you know, he personally, I don't think, cared about the Vietnamese people. They were just a sideline thing that he had to deal with. And I think it was like a monster. It grew out of control, and it overwhelmed a lot of people in the political scene and just ordinary Americans.
Well, I think the leaders of that time, they were the product of their age just as we are.
Yeah.
And you mentioned how World War II and Korea, I think World War II in particular, what had been our enemies, we defeated and renewed. We didn't build, but we renewed nations which became successful nations and allies. And I think these guys took that as their, you know, we say we fight each war like it's the last war. They were thinking that way. We can build this world to our design. But when you get over there, you know, like the raw material simply wasn't there to do it with.
But you know,
but that's why they would think that way. That's my point.
Along those lines, you look at Kennedy, you know, PT 109, and he's floating around out there in the South Pacific.
His brother got killed in World War II.
His brother died. I think he was probably tempered by war, and
Johnson
understood the sacrifices and the price to be paid. So when McNamara says Kennedy wanted to have no more than 15,000 advisors, I thought that sounded reasonable to me, that he felt
the
that
logic
way
stands there.
when he put it all together in terms of being a World War II veteran and looking at Southeast Asia. I'm not that interested.
Didn't the British help Malaysia stabilize, and they didn't, you know, they used kind of the advisor approach.
After World War II.
Yeah.
And so you can't do it for them. You can help them, and that's all you can do.
Well, it's like we help people now,
Right.
But we always say, or it goes through our mind, well, why don't you help yourself a little bit so I can help you? But a lot of people today are concerned about helping themselves as opposed to helping you. And we've lost that, I think, as American. A question that comes up quite often is about draftees in the Vietnam War. The conception is that there were a lot of draftees, that nearly every person that was fighting in Vietnam was a draftee. They were young, they were black, they were from the inner cities, they were a minority nationality, but yet that myth persists today. So what are your feelings on the draftees that were in Vietnam, the truth?
Well, speaking for myself, I was RA. I was an enlisted man, but I had a draft letter in my pocket when I enlisted. So in a way, the draft is the reason I joined the Army, even though I didn't get drafted.
I think that my observation in the units I was in, the racial ratio, you know, there was we had Puerto Ricans from Puerto Rico, and then black soldiers were about what the population of America is. And I would say in the battery, once you get below E6, everybody pretty much was a draftee.
Yeah. I noticed when I was there in 1969 and 70, and there were a lot of draftees, and it was quite a cross section.
Right.
It had people that had not finished high school. It had people that had finished college. You had just a broad section of people, many of whom were saying, "How did this happen? How did I end up drafted?"
Well, the statistics claim that only 21% of the total force that was in Vietnam, and that 21% equates to 1,800,000 only that were draftees. And I don't know how to prove or disprove it except using the government statistic, because a lot of times you'd have people on your base or whatever, they never said they was, or they never said they wasn't.
Well, I tell you what bothers me about that. I think something like 3 million GIs served in Vietnam. So let's use that as a rough number.
Yeah,
that would mean that the other 2,200,000 enlisted of their own free will.
Well, this is over a period
of
of time, too.
well,
You know, essentially from 55 to 75, which is 20 years.
I'm not saying it's wrong. I just say
Yeah.
it goes against my hunch.
That seems like it's awfully long.
It does, yeah.
Maybe.
I was stationed at Fort Hood before, and everybody that I knew at Fort Hood, just about, once you know, the senior NCOs
Right.
and your senior officers, but below E6, they had all been drafted.
Well, I've got a question and another theory I'd like to pose to you to get your opinion on. Let's assume that an evil entity wanted to invent something or make something or create something that would separate the United States, to essentially divide America in half. What could they come up with that would do that? And I contend that the Vietnam War was a divider. Before Vietnam, you had black and white TV, families were together, you had a front porch, etc. After Vietnam, those things went away. Before Vietnam, there were hardly any drugs except in the music industry. After Vietnam, there were drugs everywhere and free love and all that. But the parallel between what was and what is seems to me like was the Vietnam War was a catalyst for that. What do you all think about that?
Well, I would say whether that is the only way, that was certainly the end effect of what happened. The nation was very divided during the Vietnam War along that line, just that clear. Not really, we weren't really, the others weren't pro-war. You were just, I mean, the way I felt about it, you grew up your life knowing that you're going to go in the service. Your dad been in the service, your uncles, your granddaddy, your great-granddaddy, they all had wars. Yeah, you know, we played soldier, you know? So when the time came, you went and did it. But the people who could see it just the opposite, like you shouldn't go. I remember thinking that, well, so you're going to get drafted. Well, you could do this. You can go to Europe, you can go to Canada, you can go underground. And I thought, well, what about the rest of my life?
Yeah.
How could that even be an option? So, not for that one reason, but that's a reason. But then years later, Jimmy Carter, running for president, said he was going to grant amnesty to the draft resistors and welcome home. I thought, well, welcome home, I agree, welcome home. But what about us?
Right.
And those 58,000 plus, whose names are on that wall, who took you seriously on your word. And then we found out you changed the rules after the game.
I think that'll always be a thorn in our
It's
side.
in mine. I don't remember what the question was.
I think that the war, well, all wars expedite technology.
Right.
And I think that probably it also expedited the drug culture because drugs were available, you know, when a lot of people brought them home you know, but as far as the technology, I just think it was evolving you know, to me, the
TV,
electronic explosion, color television, all that. And then, you know, for instance, in the South, when they got air conditioners, people not going to sit on the front porch when they can sit inside in the cool.
That's true.
Yeah, I think had Vietnam not occurred, I think the country still would have continued to go through significant change, but I think it just stirred it up and aggravated and made the change process all that more confusing. You had racial things going on, profound economic changes, technological changes. we were at a time in the country's history where there were a lot of changes, but Vietnam really stirred the pot up dramatically.
Well, one of the most positive things to come out of Vietnam was battlefield trauma, how now we use the helicopters to fly people to trauma centers all over. So that was a good thing to come out of Vietnam. And if you look closely, there's a lot of other good things that happened. It wasn't all negative, wrong, or misplaced. We were Americans. We were fighting for the freedom of another person, another country. And as veterans, I would hope that we take pride in where we were, what we did. Even though it wasn't a perfect war, war is not perfect.
We should take pride in doing our duty under our nation.
I believe that every citizen owes the country a debt for his freedom.
You're right.
Some have disagreed with me, but...
And if the nation sends us to do something that turns out to have been a bad idea, that doesn't mean we did the wrong thing by going. And I'll say one more thing on that is, it's the butterfly effect in a way. If Vietnam had not happened, we don't know what all the changes in the world would be. I agree Vietnam was a real bad time, but I couldn't guarantee that if it didn't happen, we would be in a better situation today.
Well,
I mean, our
we'll
nation.
never know the answer to that, but...
No.
Well, I could probably figure it out, but...
Well, for instance, the draft, a lot of people use that to look at the rest of the world. A lot of people, some of the people stayed in service. People got a chance to go to college on the GI Bill.
Look at the people we met and interacted with that we never would have seen. Like a guy from Puerto Rico becomes your friend. I never knew a guy
remember
from
the
Puerto
first
Rico.
Polish person I met. I never saw a name that didn't have any vowels in it, and I thought, how do you say that word? You know, and you learn about the culture of the country too by being in with everybody.
Well, we got time for one more question. What do you think the state of the nation is today, military-wise? There's talking about cuts again and whatnot. Do you think we still could defend America with vigor? And
if the politicians stay out of it, we can.
Yeah, I've had an opportunity to work with some of the units down at Fort Campbell, and whenever I leave that base, I'm just amazed at the quality of those people.
Yeah.
They are very courageous, patriotic, disciplined, and I think they can handle anything anywhere in the world. I feel very comfortable with our military.
And what I would say, I believe our politicians are again forgetting how important the military is, and we're downsizing, we're kicking people out of the service who put in a substantial number of years toward a career because it's not convenient to carry them right now. Next year, next month, you may wish you had them back, and then World War II was that way. We had a very small army.
Korea.
Well, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all for being here today. We've covered a great variety of topics. Mr. Englert from Katie's, Mr. Curtis, and Mr. Gordon Williams. It's been a pleasure talking to you. I've learned some things that I hope our veteran community has, or at least cause them to think about things in a positive manner as opposed to a negative. Hi, this is Michael Swinford. I'd like to thank you for watching Veterans Voice today. Please check again that we'll have a new program coming up before long. Thank you, and God bless you.